Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi there. Welcome to Grief to Growth Podcast. Your host is Brian Smith, spiritual seeker, best-selling author, grief survivor, and life coach. Brian believes that the worst tragedies of life provide the greatest opportunity for growth. Brian says he was planted, not buried, and he is here to help you grow where you've been planted by the difficulties in life. In each episode, Brian and his guests will share what has helped them to survive and thrive. It is his sincere hope this episode helps you today.
Hey, everybody, this is Brian Smith back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today with me, I've got Claire B. Willis. And I'm going to read her bio, and then we're going to have a conversation the way we always do. Claire B. Willis is a clinical social worker who has worked in the fields of oncology and bereavement for more than 20 years. Claire is a co-founder of the Boston nonprofit Facing Cancer Together and has led bereavement, end-of-life support, and therapeutic writing groups. She taught spiritual resources for healing the mind, body, and soul at Andover Newton Theological School in Massachusetts. Claire maintains a private practice in Brookline, Massachusetts, and as a lay Buddhist chaplain, she's been ordained by Joan Halifax at Upaya Center in Santa Fe. She focuses on contemplative practices for end-of-life care. She's also an experienced yoga teacher and the author of 2 books, Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life, and her new book, which is Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace, which she co-authored with Marnie Crawford Samuelson. So her website is openingtogrief.com. And with that, I'd like to welcome to Grief to Growth, Claire B. Willis.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Yeah, Claire, it's great to meet you. As I was telling you before we got started, a lot of my audience is people who are experiencing grief and don't know, like, what do I expect? What is this like? Is this normal what I'm going through? You know, when I'm feeling, I get that question all the time. It's like, is this normal? So I guess the first thing would be like, what do you mean when you use the word grief?
Grief is a reaction that people have to any loss or separation. It's a natural, normal human response, and it has no typical presentation. So I'd love to just take a moment to say something about what you said to begin with, because I wrote this book because I kept getting the question, is my grief normal? And it just broke my heart. And what I always say is that there are as many ways to express grief as there are people who are grieving. And grief has a lot of different faces, and most people think of it as sadness or sorrow or despair, but it has relief, it has gratitude, it has anxiety, it has impatience, it has anger and rage, which I think we've seen in our political situation a lot, that's grief misplaced. It has a lot of different affective presentations, and people don't often recognize when they are grieving because they think of it in such a narrow range. The other thing that I think has come with COVID is that we see more behavioral and cognitive responses to grief. People can't concentrate. People find they're overworking, they're underworking, they can't focus, they can't read. There was an article the other day in the Times about people's inability to read anything of any length, that people were reading shorter articles. So there's a lot of different ways grief presents that people don't think of as, oh, that's my grief. But actually, there's a collective grief right now. And I don't think anybody's not grieving. And with COVID, what happened is that it opened up old losses for people as well. So not only did it bring loss to almost every aspect of our life in varying degrees, but it evoked old losses that we may or may not, or we thought we may have already grieved, but have come up to the surface, making the ones we're dealing with today even harder.
Yeah, I think that is, you made a lot of excellent points in there. So I want to unpack some of those. One is the idea of grief being normal. And people saying, well, and you said, well, sometimes we're sleeping too much, sometimes we're sleeping too little, sometimes we're working too much, sometimes we're working too little. So it's not a one size fits all thing by any means. And you said grief includes, anger and frustration and guilt, but you also mentioned relief that can be included in grief.
Yeah, relief and also gratitude. In my bereavement groups, one of my groups, it has mostly women in it who have lost long-term partners or spouses. Mm-hmm. One of the things that people have talked about is how grateful they feel to have loved for as long and with such depth as they were able to, because they felt like a lot of their friends didn't have that experience of having that good a relationship. And so that the gratitude and the grief are connected to each other. So often, we grieve what we're grateful for and lost, and we're grateful for what we've had and lost. It goes both ways.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I've never heard it really put that way before, because we're grateful and because we love the thing that we've lost so much that we have the grief. So that the love is part of it as well. And I know sometimes people feel like when they're in grief, if I let go of the pain, I'm letting go of the person.
Oh, that's so true. Jamie Anderson wrote something that just has stayed with me ever since I started doing this work. And that is, he said, grief is nothing but love with nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. And I think that is beautiful. And when I say to people, don't try and manage your grief, it's an expression of your loving. It reframes grief into something beautiful. And I think it sometimes gives people permission to let out the rawness of what they're feeling without shame, because there's a lot of shame that swirls around with grief. And one of the things that I hear in my bereavement groups a lot is, for instance, a woman said, I would only say this in here because I know you'll understand, but I'm sleeping with my husband's old shirts because I want to keep his scent. And another woman said, I'm sleeping with my dog's favorite toy. Mm-hmm. And dog had been really a companion, almost like a child to her for 14 years. And she was sleeping with a chewed up, fuzzy thing. And she told the group, and the group understood, but she didn't feel she could share that with her larger network. Yeah. So isolation and the shame and the privacy of pain exacerbates it enormously.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's so funny you brought that up, because just yesterday, someone sent me a message and said, I have a sign. I was supposed to send this to you. So she sends me a picture of penguins, and penguins are my daughter was obsessed with penguins. So I get this thing yesterday, and I just got enough for the interview, and someone asked me if I ever got any signs for my daughter. I'm like, well, okay, here's a sign. But the other thing I want to say to people, and I'll say this publicly, I've never said it before, is we sleep with my daughter's pillow pet, which is a penguin. And the day after my daughter passed away, my wife moved it into our bed. It sits right there. It's a small thing. It sits between the two of us where we sleep. And it's been 5.5 years. But we still sleep with that. And it brings us comfort. And whatever brings you comfort when you're going through grief, don't feel ashamed of it. My wife just showed me yesterday a friend who had made a quilt from her husband's shirts. She took all of her husband's old shirts and she made a quilt out of them. And she sewed a button in the middle of each one on this quilt. A beautiful, thing for her husband. And when she wraps herself in it, she feels like she's close to him.
Well, that makes complete sense. I mean, of course, right?
Yeah.
I was talking to a woman this morning who lost her son. And her son was a lover of cats. And after her son died, she decided to get a cat, and she adopted a cat. And when the cat's birth medical information came, she discovered that the cat was born the day her son had died. And these things happen that they just create goosebumps, because more than random, I think.
That's another thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. That people, when we're going through grief, we get a lot of assistance from the other side that people aren't aware of, and we don't talk about much. And we talk about these signs and synchronicities. They're little, I call them Easter eggs, or like little things along the way. Like Easter eggs is a term they use in video games, where the programmer puts something in just to kind of, like a nod or a wink. And I think we get those things if we keep our minds open to it.
That's right. Yeah, people talk about signs in my bereavement group all the time, and they often come through birds. Mm-hmm. I hear them through birds a lot.
Well, that's another thing that people, they're like, well, I'll share this with you here, in the group. I can't say this outside, and that's what we're here to do, is to say the quiet parts out loud, because we want to give people permission to feel whatever it is you're feeling and understand it's all okay.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wrote the book, to try to normalize everybody's experience, no matter what it was, so that they would feel less alone. And I think one of the things that my co-author and I were really pleased about was that most of the endorsers described the book as a companion. And the word companion means one with whom you break bread. And we wanted the book to feel like, to have the reader feel like they weren't alone, and that what we write about they were seeing in other people. Because grief brings with it so much loneliness, but you don't have to be alone while you're grieving. And we were hoping the book would offer that kind of companionship so that people wouldn't feel alone.
Yeah. And from just what we've talked about here, I can tell that it will offer that, because again, people are worried about, is my grief normal? What's the normal progression for grief? How long can I expect this to last? So how would you answer that question if someone asks you?
You want it to last your whole life because you loved that much. So I would say two things to that. One is that Joan Wickersham, who's a Boston Globe columnist, wrote an interesting article 5 or 6 years ago, and she talked about being at a cocktail party, and she meets a woman whose husband died 5 years ago, and she notices that every time this woman starts to talk to someone, she brings up her husband. Then she meets a man who married his best friend within a year of married his wife's best friend within a year of his wife's death, and brings her to the party. And Joan writes in this, both of these are expressions of grief. So I love that, because it just brings in the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
How long should grief last? If grief is an expression of your loving, it should never go away. But what I say to people, because that can sound like a despairing comment, I say that when someone you love first dies, the walls of your house, the ceiling, the floor, the furniture, everything is gray. There's no light, because that grief is all there is. It's searing. It consumes every minute of your day. And with the passage of time, more things fill in between you and that loss. But always there's a gray chair that will remain in your living room amidst the color coming back from the rest of the house. And I also have heard this analogy, which I love, which is grief is like a broken bone. When you break the bone, it kills, it hurts. You maybe have surgery, you have the bone reset, then you have PT, and you're fine. But on rainy days, the bone tends to ache.
Yeah.
I like that, because it's sort of the progression of grief. It doesn't go away, and it shouldn't, but it does change in intensity, duration, and frequency.
Yes.
And that's important to remember.
Yeah, I love the analogy you use, and I think what you said is really important, because people say, "Well, I don't want to feel this way forever." It's like, it doesn't mean you're going to feel this way forever, but as long, and I've said this to people, and it sounds like a despairing comment, but it's not. I will always grieve my daughter. I mean, I hope to always grieve my daughter, because I will always love my daughter. It changes, and her 21st birthday was last week, and some days it's more intense than others. That day was more intense. Some days it's a little bit better. It's like
What's the date of her birthday?
I'm sorry.
What's the date of her birthday?
January 13th. January 13th. That was her 21st birthday. So there are those rainy days, when it feels more achy than other days. But then there's also the days of love. And you also, I wanted to ask you the difference between moving on and moving forward.
Moving on and moving forward are all together different. Moving on, when you use those words, it sort of suggests that you're moving away from who and what you lost. Moving forward, you are taking that person, that situation, that event with you. And it works. Grief works us if we allow it to.
Mm-hmm.
We work grief. And I see that grief has taken you probably into this work with a passion.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know something about suffering. And the likelihood is you want to try and help other people not suffer to the extent you did or do.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that idea of moving on versus moving forward, it's a small word, but I agree with you. It's a world of difference, because when people talk to me about moving on, I'm like, I will never move on. I don't want to move on. But when someone said you can move forward with your daughter, that then this space between me and when she passed wasn't my enemy anymore, because I'm looking forward to something. And I find that's a big difference.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the things that I worry about sometimes, and I'm sure you've seen this happen, is that somehow moving forward suggests moving away from, suggests leaving the person behind.
Mm-hmm.
I always say, I think one of the pitfalls of grief is that grief can become the way you stay connected, as opposed to, for instance, this woman I was talking to this morning who lost her son. She said her son loved music, and she's thinking of creating a playlist for people who have lost loved ones that speaks to the grief through music.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was pretty brilliant. So it's a way she'll stay connected to her son, but she's also, through her grief, becoming generous with others in the way you are. At some point, can we find a way through the suffering to be generous and take that suffering into the world in a healing way? But that takes time.
Yes. Yeah, that's another thing we know about grief is it does take time, and we have to be patient with ourselves and with the process as we work with it and it works with us.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and speaking of moving on versus moving forward, you were talking about music. I love music, and I have a playlist that it's on my YouTube channel. And every time I find an inspiring song, I add it to that playlist. And there's a song, and there's a lyric in it that says, I don't want to let go of the pain because it feels too much like saying goodbye.
That's exactly was my point.
Yeah.
That's exactly my point. Yeah. Is your playlist online?
It is. Yeah. It's on my YouTube channel. And I do add to it, it's songs that speak to me. And I find it's very healing, because what it does, it's funny, because I remember when I was first, after my daughter passed, I walk every day. I walk for about an hour and a half every morning. And I'm like, why do I like listening to sad music? Because it's just going to make me more sad. But what I realized is it made me feel not as alone. And it's that thing about grief being lonely is when I realized this is a universal thing that everyone goes through. And when I would listen to an artist express my exact emotions in a song, I'm like, wow, this is universal. This is okay.
This is what I like about poetry, because music and poetry bypass cognition. They go right to the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why each of those is such a powerful medium. I mean, one of the things that people say about both my books is that the comment I hear most frequently is the poetry is so well selected. And poetry really goes in deeply.
Yeah.
The right moment. And it's like music. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, lyrics are poetry, right? So it's kind of very, it's kind of the same thing.
The melody too. It can be more than the it's not the lyrics alone, right?
Right.
It's the combination. And sometimes it's just music. I mean, I can remember, the piece Pachelbel's Canon.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there something sad about that?
Yeah, there's something about music. You're right. That just the music can evoke emotion. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, another question I get a lot of times, and this is really interesting, I think, is stages of grief. Okay. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously wrote about the stages of death and dying. What do you think about stages of grief?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's grief2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month, or of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode.
I don't have any use for them. So let me just clarify something. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote about the stages of grief, which are completely brilliant. She was describing someone who was dying, the grief someone goes through who's losing their life. She was not describing the course of bereavement. Having said that, people often go through those processes, but not in any linear way. And sometimes they don't. But that's one of the things that has become really oppressive for people who are grieving. Like, it's not unusual for me to hear someone say in my bereavement group, I thought I was doing really well. And I think you'll relate to this, Brian. And I went to the supermarket, and when I saw that can of tuna fish, I just lost it, because that was my brother's favorite brand and can of tuna. And I thought I was doing well. And one of the things that I always say, which has been so comforting, is that there is a phenomenon in the grief literature, which you probably know about, called STUG, which is an acronym for sudden temporary upsurge of grief. And emerges so unexpectedly. It's always temporary. It generally is gone in 24 hours, but it catches people off guard because they immediately assume they're not doing grief right, or they've gone backwards, or they're regressing, or pick the verb,
sure,
but never in their self-interest. And it's been really helpful for people to hear that there's actually a phenomenon that's universal that people experience when they're grieving, or they think they see their loved one on the street. I mean, that's happened to me a number of times. Someone I loved who's died, I swear they've come back.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I'm glad. I didn't know there was an acronym for that, but I've certainly experienced it. And I know I've documented it through the people that I've worked with, and I call them grief waves. And I'm like, and sometimes they can be triggered. I mean, we have triggers. It might be a can of tuna, it might be a song. For me, it's driving past the White Castle that's near my house. So we might have something, but sometimes they just come out of the blue. And we don't even, I was just talking with the client earlier, and this person's like, I start to feel heat through my body, and it just rises up through my chest, and then it just comes out, and I have no idea why it's happening. But that's not an uncommon thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So I'm always trying, and you're probably doing the same thing. I'm always trying to normalize these things, because the privacy of pain in our culture is really hurtful to us, which is why I love group work. I love it because people can finish each other's sentences. They really understand each other. It's like a shorthand between them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in our society, because we are so closed down and we don't share bad emotions, that people, and I love it, we've got to normalize this. We've got to say, whatever you're feeling, the feeling is okay. Now, the only exception I will say is like if someone's thinking about hurting themselves or hurting someone else. Yeah. But even having that thought of hurting yourself when, especially in my case, when it's a child that's passed away, that's a very common thing for parents to have.
That's right. Yeah, well, I was listening to that this morning. One of the things that is, I hate to use this word, one of the positive outcomes of COVID. I don't want to say one of the positive things about COVID. One of the positive outcomes about COVID is that it's brought the word grief into the mainstream culture in a different way. And we see articles about grief in the New York Times. We see it in the Atlantic. We see it in mainstream media. And to me, that's been really a gift to people, because I think before COVID, grief was something that was private and kept to yourself. And so now I think it's more appropriate and a more legitimate, quote unquote, for people to express grief than it was beforehand.
Yeah, and I like that. That's why I love the way you define grief up front. It can be any loss, and I think people are starting to recognize that COVID has caused. I think it's pretty much universal. We're all grieving something. We've lost a job. We've lost a loved one. We've lost freedom. We've lost certainty. We've lost social connections. We've all sacrificed something to this pandemic. And so we can all kind of start to relate to each other's, grief that we're going through. And I think people are feeling a little bit more comfortable about sharing the struggle that this universal grief has caused to happen to all of mankind at one time.
When you're saying that made me think of a grief that I want to mention. Two I want to mention. One is the loss of a pet. There's a lot of privacy around that, and the loss of a pet can be as poignant for a person who's childless as the loss of a child is, because it's a pure, unconditional love, and our love between human beings is much more complex with its histories and conflicts, and it's complicated. And it's not a less or more, but it's different. And it's important that grief, which is so disenfranchised, comes out and becomes more legitimate and more openly expressive. People grieve privately when they lose a pet, and it just adds hell. The other grief that I just want to mention in passing is what we call ambiguous griefs. And there's a lot of ambiguous griefs in our culture. So you could have someone that's physically present, but psychologically absent. So dementia or Alzheimer's or brain injury or even addiction, as say an alcoholic. Or you could have somebody that's psychologically present, but physically absent, hospitalizations in COVID, divorce, separation, retirement, infertility. They're often non-death losses, but we don't think of them as legitimate things to grieve because the people are still around.
Yeah, I want to talk about both of those more because I think they're both extremely important. The loss of a pet. I've had two dogs that I've had to help transition, and the thing about the love of a pet is it is pure love, and it is unconditional love. And the other thing about a pet is always like a child. They never grow up, they never grow away. They're always dependent on you. So a pet is in very many ways like having a child forever. My little dog is asleep behind me right now. So I want to give people permission when you have a pet, transition, you're going to feel the same emotions you're going to feel if it's a person.
I had to put down my little cockapoo who had cancer on March 1st. And little did I know that 10 days later, I would be in lockdown. Oh. And it was hard because what I wanted more than anything was to spread his ashes with friends in my backyard. And everybody was physically out of touch with one another. So I have a special place in my heart about that. Yeah.
And I was just talking with someone right before we got on whose son had passed away about a year ago, right during COVID. And he had gotten a dog not too long before that. And he was saying that the dog has been helping him, make it through this time without his son being here. And I think that's such a profound love that animals give us. So don't feel guilty about, grieving your pet just the way you would, if it was a person. Yeah. And the other thing you talked about, I think is also really important, is that grief doesn't have to involve death. Both of my in-laws my father-in-law passed from dementia. My mother-in-law is going through it now. And I've seen, like my father-in-law, he wasn't here. His body was still here, but he wasn't here for the last, year or so of his life. And my mother-in-law is not the person that she was. So I know that my wife and myself, because I'm very close to them, are going through a type of grief, even now.
It's not something that's often labeled grief because they're alive. But I remember my father growing demented, and he would have moments of what seemed to be lucidity.
Mm-hmm.
I would think, oh, he's back. And then he would slip away again. And I think that's one of the really painful things about dementia or Alzheimer's, these moments of glimmers of light that can appear.
Yeah.
And they go away. But ambiguous grief is very tough to resolve because there's no endpoint,
Right.
No endpoint. It's learning to live. And also a form of grief, some of them are griefs where, for instance, you have both positive and negative, not positive and grief feelings. So, for instance, I'm thinking about retirement. People who retire look forward to retirement, but there's a lot of loss that comes with retirement. It's not all one feeling or the other.
Yeah.
With ambiguous grief often. That's
a good point too, because feelings can be complex and we can feel two ways about the same thing. And retirement, I think, is an excellent example. And, having children move out, I went through that. That was terrible for me when my daughter graduated from high school.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't hear people say, I'm grieving the loss of my daughter. She's gone to college.
Yeah.
Because you're supposed to celebrate with her. But I don't think there's a parent alive that doesn't feel a loss when their daughter or son leave home.
Yeah. So I think I like the way we're opening this up because it's a universal thing that we all experience like many times through our lives. And we can tend to put grief in a box and say it's only when someone dies. And even that is different, because, my daughter passing away versus my grandmother passing away, two completely different experiences.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, we were talking about like opening this thing up about grief and not defining it so narrowly. And the other thing is helping people understand that we're going to experience it. It's unique for each of us. And whatever your experience is, it's kind of okay. I guess we already talked about timetable of grief. I'm looking through some of the questions I wanted to ask you. So what are some of the ways that you would suggest people deal with their grief? We've talked about what grief is and how we might feel. So what do I do about it when I have grief?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.grieftgrowth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it.
Well, the first thing I would say is to treat yourself kindly. That kindness is really the only reliable anchor for holding grief. And it's important to start with the first chapter of our book is called Starting with Kindness. And we deliberately, very strategically put it first because there's so many models and expectations around grief that we wanted to make sure to counter those so that people would just stay with their own experience with kindness. The book is filled with practices for holding grief. One of the this is going to sound counterintuitive, but one of the things that we talk about, I think in the second or third chapter, is having a gratitude practice. And that does not mean negating 1 ounce of grief or anything negative, but it means trying to hold alongside the sorrow and loss what is still good that's left. And the reason for that is not to have this sort of toxic positivity, but it's to help us in order to hold the depth of suffering and sorrow from a loss. it helps us to notice alongside what is also right. So in noticing what's right, we're strengthening our capacity to hold grief.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's important. It's not about being positive, but it's about noticing what's right. Our minds are habituated towards what's negative. We're hardwired that way. And we're hardwired that way because in ancient times, it helped us survive. It's not a bad thing. But what we need to do is to learn to linger and stay with what's good. And if we do that for 10 to 30 seconds, when we notice something good, we can actually begin to rewire our brains and strengthen our resilience in the face of suffering.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com, or text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF, to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
So one of the things that I always suggest to people is that before they go to bed, to try to write down 3 things that are positive, that they're grateful for, that happened that day, and to express them in positive language. So, for instance, let's say you have a house full of children and your house is somewhat chaotic. To write, my house, the kids were finally not noisy today, is a negative expression of a positive event. So I would say what you would write would be, the house was peaceful. And just to try to find 3 things each day. And what happens is that instead of the mind being habituated towards what's negative, if you're committed to the practice, you'll start to notice in the course of a day what's right. And it changes your attention, because what you attend to will shape your brain. So we want to shape it in a way that's healthy and helps us hold our suffering and grief, and lets the grief work us. So I say this gratitude journal with all these caveats, because I don't want it to be ever at the expense of grief, but I want it to be alongside grief. That's one of the practices that we talk about in the book. Another one is writing. There's a lot of writing research that has documented that writing for 3 to 4 times a week for things that are bothersome will actually increase our immune system, decrease our anxiety, and decrease our depression. And so that's an important thing, is just writing our feelings, because we don't want to use the energy to inhibit ourselves from what we feel, because that suppresses our immune system. So letting ourselves journal write is very important. Being out in the natural world is very important. There's a lot of research about the impact of restorative environments, which is any place basically outside. It can be a city park, it can be your yard, it can be a school park, just somewhere where there's grass and green and trees. That our eyes rest, our being rests in a way in the natural world that it can't rest when we're at the computer, when we're inside working. The natural world gives us something that strengthens our immune system, also lessens our depression and anxiety. So those are 3 practices that come right off the top of the book.
Yeah. I love the way you start with kindness for yourself. I find so many people are really hard on themselves. They're like, am I doing this right? I'm not doing it fast enough. I should be over this by now. And some of that's put out by outside forces too, because they'll say,
it is from outside. It's from books.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books that say this is how long it'll last.
Yeah. So I like that you start with that. And I like, it's funny. I was smiling as you were talking about the gratitude practice. It's something that I do. I do it in the morning when I get up. So I the same things you're just saying, I try to think of 3 things and I try to word them in a positive way. And it does sound counterintuitive when I first heard about it, when I was in my early deep stages of grief. I'm like, this is crazy. There's nothing to be happy about.
I know.
But there's always something to be grateful for. And, if you read a book by like Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, you'll realize this guy's in a concentration camp and he can find something to be grateful for. I just interviewed a person that has ALS and she's literally can't speak. I had to interview her through the computer. And she's found some things to be grateful for. So I would say that the people that are listening, no matter what circumstance you're in, there's something you can be grateful for. Is it warm in your house right now? Do you have food in your refrigerator? It could be something very small.
I'm leading a group right now in conjunction with a Buddhist priest for people who are dying. We're doing it online, and we have people with ALS, and everybody else who doesn't have ALS has stage 4 metastatic cancer. Mm-hmm. And the gratitude in that group is palpable.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing, isn't
it? It's so moving. I think to myself, thank you for showing up for me.
Exactly.
What I'm doing is of use to you, but you're giving me so much. It's really an extraordinary experience. It's very humbling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you talked about being out in nature. I know you've studied Buddhism, you're a Buddhist. So what about meditation? Do you recommend that for people?
There's a chapter in the book called Mindfulness and Meditation. Mm-hmm. I do. And one of the things that is true for most of us is that the research indicates that 50% of the time our minds are in the past, 40% of the time our minds are in the future, and on a very, very good day, 10% of the time our minds are we are where our body is. Mm-hmm. And I think after a loss, many things can set in. And one of them, which is very common, is anxiety, just a pervasive anxiety, because the world has been, as you've known it, has been shattered, and you have to reconstitute yourself. Mm-hmm. Things have happened that weren't supposed to happen for the most part. And a mindfulness and meditation practice reminds us to stay in the moment and tries to interrupt those rumination loops or perseveration loops where we can get into a chronic anxiety mode, but coming back to the breath. And we use in the book a practice called metta meditation, which means loving kindness or tender friend. Mm-hmm. And it's a practice. Are you familiar with it?
I am, yes.
Yeah, it's a practice where you start by extending yourself blessings. Then you extend to people you love. Then you extend to neutrals, like the mailman or the grocery person. And then you extend to people you don't like. But we only concentrate on extending it to ourselves. And each chapter, we close each chapter with a metta meditation. So in the first chapter, I think on kindness, it might be, the metta might be something like, may I accept the feelings that come my way. May I allow my grief to strengthen my heart. May I find peace in my grief. So I can't remember exactly what they are, but that's the way it goes. They are phrases to start with may I. Mm-hmm. And I often ask people to create the phrases they need for their journey. May you have strength for your journey. Things like that. Mm-hmm. And everybody needs their own. So that, yes, meditation and mindfulness is one of the practices. It's one of the chapters in the book that we feel is really important. And there's a lot of research. Each chapter is based on research that shows that these practices help people with grief and anxiety and depression.
Yeah. So what do you say to someone that says, I've tried to meditate, I just can't do it?
I can't either. And I sit every day for a half an hour. So no one can do it, really. There's no accomplishing it, but the effort is important to attend to it. There's a great New Yorker cartoon where all these people are sitting cross-legged and they have their hands in the meditation position with circles on their knees, and they look so serene, right? And then you have these word bubbles coming out of each person's head. And one person says, oh, I forgot to call Whole Foods before I left work to place an order. Or, oh, I forgot this. And each person has a bubble coming out of their head. And the last one says, I'll bet everybody in the room can do this but me.
Yes.
People cannot concentrate on their breath more than 1 to 2 to 3 breaths at the most. And so one of the things that I often suggest to people is that they connect words to their breathing. So you might want to say, breathing in, you say it to yourself, breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. Breathing in, I soften my belly. Breathing out, my breath lengthens. If you put words to the breath, it's much easier to meditate than if you just follow the breath without any language. So that's what I would say to someone who says, I can't meditate. But, truthfully, it's a practice. We don't get good at it easily, but the attempt makes a big difference. When I was working for the Dean Ornish program for reversing heart disease, I was the stress management consultant, and they had people coming in for physical exercise. These were all heart patients. And one time, I remember this one particular day, the person in charge of exercise said, Claire, would you please take this woman into the room? She's too anxious. I don't want her on the machines. She needs to be calmed down. And she told me her daughter had just been diagnosed with cancer. And so I led her through this guided meditation for about 10 minutes. And when she was done, she said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do any of it. But when they took her blood pressure had dropped and her heart rate had dropped, and she was able to get on the machines. So often we don't think we're doing anything, and we can't do it when we are doing it. Mm-hmm. So I would say that too.
Yeah, I think that's great. Because I've had so many people say that to me, I can't meditate. And I would say, I love what you said at the beginning, everybody thinks everybody can meditate better than they can. None of us can shut off our thoughts for 30 minutes, And I've heard people say, I was there, I was thinking, I wasn't having a thought. And then I just thought I didn't have a thought. Well, that's a thought. And then they get themselves back in the monkey mind. But for me, the goal, the purpose of meditation is learning to catch ourselves. It's if you didn't have those distractions, you wouldn't need to meditate, but it's having those distractions and training the mind to come back. So this is the way it works for me anyway, is I've learned to know when I'm spinning out, and I've learned to how to turn that off. So I sleep so much better now that I've meditated every day for the last 4 years now. And I sleep so much better because when I get in bed and my mind starts racing, I know it's racing. So I just say, I'm just going to go to the breath. And next thing I know, I'm asleep.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because meditation is the moment you catch that and you come back to the breath.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad you mentioned that, Brian. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing I will say, this is my thing, and I share with people because everybody has to find their own tool that works for them when it comes to grief. It's because we all share things, and yoga works for some people, it doesn't work for other people. But I use an app called Insight Timer, and it's got all these different guided meditations, or sometimes I listen to music. So try different things that work for you. I was talking to my mother a long time about my meditation, and she's like, I just can't do it. I can't do it. And I started giving her some guided meditations, and she could sit as long as someone was guiding her through it. Yeah. And those I found can be very beneficial for people.
Thank you for saying that. And yes, Insight Timer is a wonderful tool. Yeah. And it's free.
So those are some ways that those are tools we can give people. And as I said, try them out and find what works for you. I interviewed a young lady who her mother had passed away, and she tried all the things people recommended. She tried yoga, that didn't work. She tried walking, that didn't work. She tried meditation. She found out weightlifting worked for her, and she just started lifting weights, and she ended up becoming a power lifter, and that worked for her. So
that reminds me that this is in our book. There's a walking group in Canada where these people gather each week and they walk. They say the name of the person who died. They say when the person died and what their relationship. There's no advice. There's no support. And they just walk together in silence.
Oh, wow.
And it's very powerful. It's been incredibly helpful for people.
Yeah, like I said, it's, I say to people, whatever happens to work for you, all of our minds work differently. I do most of the stuff we've talked about. I walk every day. I do a gratitude practice every day. I do a meditation, I do a meditation, usually 20, 25 minutes every day. Those are the tools that happen to work for me. And I've tried, many different things. I like the fact that your book, gives people things to choose from. And I'd say, try those things and see how they work for you, and fine tune them to work for you for whatever it is you're going through.
That's right. Each chapter in the book is a resource for people to help them hold grief. And you can think of it as a toolbox. You can just dip into any chapter. But if you read the book, start for sure with the chapter kindness, starting with kindness, and grief as a companion. Those are the two chapters at the beginning.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of what the next question I wanted to ask you was. You talked a little bit about writing. So you said that writing actually helps people to process their grief. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it helps people hold the grief too.
Mm-hmm.
It helps them hold and express it. One of the things that I hear a lot in my bereavement groups, people will say things like, there's so many memories I had that I don't ever want to forget, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget them. And I say, you will. You will forget them. I mean, that's the truth. So one of the writing exercises I give people is to sit down for a few minutes every day and just write the sentence, I remember, and see what comes up. Mm-hmm. And when that's done, I remember, and see what comes up. I remember. And there's a little book by Joe Brainerd called I Remember, in which the whole book is nothing but sentences about I remember. It's not necessarily a memoir or a book about someone they lost, but the technique is very powerful. And or creating a story about what happened. And if you can't write in the first person, I always say write in the third person. Fictionalize it to the extent you can, so that you don't implode with grief. You want to modulate your grief so that you can work with it and not have it overwhelm you when you're writing. But I think writing, and there's a lot of writing techniques I do for holding that can be very, very helpful.
So have you, I think you mentioned this, have people expressed to you, because I've had people express this to me, I'm scared I'm going to forget my loved one. I'm scared I'm going to forget what they sounded like, or I'm scared I'm going to forget, who they are or something. Have you come across that?
Oh, yeah, I hear that a lot. And I think that can be the slippery slope, Brian, where people hang on to their grief in order to stay connected. Mm-hmm. That somehow, if their grief starts to subside, they feel like their loved one is slipping away. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was saying, I think I said this already, but I was talking to this woman this morning, was about how to take from the person they loved and lost aspects of their life and bring them forward into work that serves others. Mm-hmm. How do we carry the legacy of who we've loved and bring it through our life into service to others so that they may not suffer the same? Oftentimes people will do fundraisers for the cause that the person they love died, or I can't think. I'm thinking right now of a woman who lost her husband in 9/11, and she created a grief center out in Boston, where she has a huge staff of people. All they do is grief work. So there are ways to take this and carry our loved one as a legacy.
Yeah.
From them. And I always ask people how many people are talking to those they loved. I don't say, do you? I say, how many of you are? So I like to embed the assumption that we are all talking to those who've left us.
Yeah, let's talk about that some more, because I was going to ask you, the next question I was going to ask you is, do you talk about carrying the relationship forward? I mean, we can do things in their legacy. We can do scholarship funds, and we can do memorials and stuff, but what about maintaining the relationship with the person who has passed?
You're familiar with continuing bonds?
Yes, I am.
And I also, another person, Lorraine Hedke, writes about remembering conversations. And I often say to people, like this morning, I said to this woman, what would your son be wanting you to be doing right now with your grief? Mm-hmm. What do you think would have meaning for him? And asking people, what would your husband say now? What would he advise you? I encourage people to tap into the knowing of that person and bring that person into their life now, whether it's through letter writing, and I have clients that write letters at night or to their loved ones, unsent letters. But I encourage people to dialogue and listen for responses from their loved ones, whether they're imagined or not. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Because they carry the voice, they carry the soul of those people they've loved with them. And they just have to tap into it and trust it.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, my daughter's behind me, she's always right here over my shoulder. And I say good morning to her every morning. I say good night to her every night. And she's with me throughout my day, and she inspires, frankly, what I do. That's what works for me. So I love the idea of continuing bonds. And when I got into doing this work, I know in the past, traditional grief counseling was, okay, the relationship's over. Let's accept the fact that it's over, and we're going to teach you how to move on without that person.
Move on, yeah.
And that does not work for me. I don't know if it works for other people.
It doesn't work for anybody, actually.
Yeah.
What it does is it pushes our grief under, and then it's going to come out sideways. We're going to become irritable. We're going to become impatient. We're going to snap at things and be reactive. It doesn't work for anybody to push it down as much as we may want to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's like I said, for me, that's what makes it bearable is the fact that I can still continue that relationship. It depends on what the relationship was. Like I said, when my grandmother passed away when I was in my 20s, and she was like a mother to me, but I was like, she was older, and that's the natural flow of life. It's okay. I can deal with that. But when it was my daughter, when she was 15, I had to like, okay, this is a whole different thing. I have to do this completely differently. And it really changes you. I mean, it changes who you are. And another thing I wanted to ask you is, I'm sure you get this a lot. People come in and they say, okay, my life is over. That's it. I'm done. This I cannot live without this person. So what would you say to that?
I would say, tell me about that. I would ask them to flesh that out. I wouldn't say your life isn't over. I would say, what makes you think that? Tell me what your current sources of joy are. I would try to ask them questions. Who are the people in your life that are most significant? How is that going to change as a result of the death of? I would just keep fleshing and fleshing.
Yeah.
Until it moved from being a black, hard statement to a gray area.
Yeah.
It was opened and softer and had more, what can I say, heart in it, less, more of a response.
Yeah, being open to the possibility, because I think early in grief, and again, depending on what it is, I've only had one major grief in my life. As I said, other people have been people that are older, but with my daughter, I wasn't even open to the possibility of healing. I mean, people talk about you can heal. I'm like, I don't want to heal. That's I think it's fairly common in the situation that I was in.
The question is, what makes you feel like you can't heal? What would healing look like?
Yeah.
There's a good one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think anytime we negate anything someone says, we're shoving their grief away.
Yeah.
It's going to be completely unhelpful. I think the most important thing we can do is just to keep inviting people. I'm curious. Tell me more why you feel that way. Negate anything, any part of anybody's experience.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I guess the other thing is, though, if someone's coming to you, to a group, or they've bought your book, then they're obviously open to something, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken that first step. So, but we still might say that thing, okay, I don't want to heal, or I don't know that I can heal. And I like what you're saying is like, okay, I'm not going to try to correct you, but I'm going to try to help you find the answers within yourself, right? Because that's the other thing with people. A lot of times I think they come to us looking for answers. Like, I want you to answer my questions and tell me how to do this and how am I supposed to feel? And I hear you saying, okay, let's explore this is more like it.
Yes, let's explore it. I think one of the things that I learned in chaplaincy program at Upaya is to keep saying, I'm curious, tell me more. And I've actually used that when I've gotten into heated political conversations. I was very interested in hearing the thinking sometimes of people who were voting for the person I didn't vote for. And most of my friends are of a similar political posture. And I'm curious, tell me more. Oh, you think that happened? Tell me how you think that. Just keep asking the questions, because then you're building at least a bridge to understanding, and you're not shutting the other person down. And that's the important thing in grief, is not to shut one another down, is to keep listening and inviting whatever is there to come into the light of day, because nothing will be healed until it comes to light. And even then it takes time.
Yeah, that kind of brings us back around to what we were talking about before we started recording. Today's Inauguration Day, and we have a new administration, in the White House. But 50% of the people who voted are grieving right now, and this happens every election. 50% of the people right now are grieving the Inauguration Day. 50% of the people right now are celebrating the inauguration that happened today. And I think for people to understand that those people are grieving, and to understand that those people feel a sense of loss. They feel a real sense of loss and betrayal, and this can't happen. So some of these grief techniques we're talking about can be applied, even to that.
It's so interesting that you're saying this, because the other night I heard an interview, I forget what show it was on, with a white supremacist who had, converted into not being a supremacist. Anyway, and she was working with other supremacists to try to bring them out of their posture of white supremacy. And the person that was interviewing her was asking her how she did that. And she said, I never have a political discussion. I look for all the areas of intersection we have outside of politics, and I try to bring a human face to that. I stay out of the political realm and find common interest so I can begin to build a bridge. And not until you have a bridge can you really begin to discuss the difference in politics. And I thought that was very astute. Her job now was trying to convert white supremacists into a more tolerant view.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, getting back to your book, it's interesting because I think a lot of times people say, I need to buy a book on grief because I just lost a loved one. But, if you've gone right now, we could probably all use this book. And if we don't need it right now, we're going to need it, because grief is a universal thing that we all go through. And so I'm encouraging people, if you're listening to this podcast, you think I don't really need the book right now, get it now and read it now, because it'll help you now. And it'll also help you in the future when you have what you think is a real grief event.
The book also is, one of the things that people have written on Amazon is that the book also is life skills.
Right.
It's more than a book for grief. It's really a book for living too.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. All the skills, all the tools that you mentioned, we can use all throughout our life because again, we're always grieving or have grief about something. We've all been divorced or lost a job or lost a home or had our children grow up and move out of the house. And all these techniques that, I was fortunate. I was doing mindfulness and I was walking before Shana passed away. And if you do that, and if you build that practice before that event happens, it gives you a resiliency that you might not otherwise have. And then you're not trying to build everything from scratch.
That's right. That's so true, Brian. That's so true. That's such a good point you're making. Yeah, to use it before you need it.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say, because this is another thing I see people doing is, and maybe it's just people that come to me because they're overachievers. They're like, I was talking with someone earlier. It's like, okay, I'm in 4 or 5 grief groups. I'm doing this. I'm seeing a counselor. I'm changing my diet. I'm starting to exercise. Just trying to do everything at once. So what would your advice be? Like, how do I get into this, doing these practices?
Try one at a time. Start with kindness and don't abuse yourself with what you think you should be doing, because that's not kind, actually, to be pushing yourself to do all these things. Just being with what is, with an open heart, will accomplish a lot.
Yeah. So that also kind of brings me back around to, because I want to talk to you about the difference between like grief and depression, because a lot of times people will say, okay, you go to a doctor and you've lost someone, and the doctor goes, okay, well, you're depressed. Here's some Zoloft, get over it. So how do I know, like, when do I seek professional help? How do I know the difference between grief and depression, what's normal, and when I need to be on medication, for example?
So this is a tricky question. So I think when you're grieving, you tend to have moments of grief and moments of joy. There are breaks from the grief. When you're depressed, the world is gray. There are no openings. Seeking professional help, it's interesting. A lot of the people I work with are leading fully functioning lives, and many of them have therapists for extra support. Would they be doing okay without it? Yes. So it can be a luxury and it can be a necessity. I would say that if you're drinking a lot to the point of dysfunction, you're sleeping away and not getting to work, if you're feeling at all suicidal, those are problematic signs. And those would require, I think, professional help. Just those are the obvious ones. But I think, having a therapist, if you're a talk-oriented person, can be a wonderful companion in the grief, someone who follows you. And I don't think it's necessary. I personally think bereavement groups are wonderful when they're well led, because you see you're not alone with people who can almost finish your sentences.
Yeah.
I so often hear that's exactly how I feel. And the person doesn't even need to say anything more. They just hear their stories in one another. And that's so healing, because the isolation of grief, the loneliness of grief exacerbates it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I would like to add to that is, I guess in our society, we're all about feeling good, and people's like, I want to feel good, or I want to feel back to normal. It's normal to feel sad when you're in grief. And I went to a doctor not too long after my daughter had passed away. It was the first time I'd seen him. And he asked me about my stress level and all that kind of stuff. And so my stress level is through the roof. My daughter passed away a year ago. And I was so appreciative because, I said, yeah, I'm depressed, because they asked if you're depressed. And I said, hey, I'm sad because my daughter passed away. He goes, well, that's normal. That's okay. Are you functioning okay? Are you drinking too much? Are you feeling suicidal? No, I'm coping fine. And he said, okay, great. Then he was an older guy. He's probably about my age. I went to see a doctor not too long after that. This was a young doctor, and same questions. And I told her, she started to write me a prescription. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't need that. And I don't want that. I am sad because my daughter passed away, and that's normal, and I want to hold on to this for right now.
See, this is where models of grief have really oppressed and hurt us. And I think, and the DSM,
yes,
the DSM has not helped. And that's the medical model. And, I think it's like if you're still upset after 3 months or 6 months, I'm not sure which, you can be called depressed. And that's such a disservice to the natural, normal process of grief. It's such a disservice.
I completely agree. And like I said, I'm 5.5 years out, and I still have good days and bad days, and I still feel some sadness, and that's okay. And I sit with it, and I live with it. And that's part of the love. If you've got love for somebody, especially like it's a daughter, my daughter, and it's 5 years later, I'm going to feel sad about that sometimes. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we try to medicate it in any way, or try to bury it. We need to process it. We need to sit with it, and we need to, let it be our friend, let the grief be our companion.
I think what you're saying is important. And I just want to say there are people, because of whatever they're bringing to the grief, may not be able to do that and do need medication.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I wouldn't want someone to feel badly because they're taking medication.
Yeah, absolutely not. No, there are, and I tell everybody that I work with, there are times, and I'm not a medical professional, so if you need to take that, that's fine. And it can be a help. I've been on medication for a short time. When I was going through talk therapy before Shana passed, but when I went to my therapist, I said, I worked with her and my doctor. I said, I'm going to see the therapist, but I want to have a plan and I want to be off of this. But I won't go off it until you tell me it's okay. So that was a plan I decided to use.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to say I'm glad you added that, because I'm not saying people should not take medication. There's definitely a time and a place for it, but normal grief, if it's not complicated grief, you probably don't need medication.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Claire, it's been really great getting to meet you. Any final thoughts you want to give before we close today?
Well, I just want to come back to what Jamie Anderson said about how grief is an expression of love that has no place to go, and not to try to push it away too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's an expression of the depth of your loving. I just think that's such an important reframe of it, especially in light of the cultural expectations of, 3 days off from work and you come back and you're supposed to function. I mean, it's so ridiculous, It
is. It absolutely is.
No, you're shoveling against the tide in grieving, and stay with your process. Stay with what you need to the extent you can, and don't let anybody tell you how to do it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I want to give your contact information again. Your website is openingtogrief.com. And your latest book is Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way to Loss, From Loss to Peace, by Claire B. Willis and Marnie Crawford Samuelson. I assume that's available on Amazon and et cetera?
What I say to people is buy locally and review on Amazon. But yes, it's available on Amazon. You can have it in 24 hours.
Okay, great. That sounds great. Well, Claire, thanks for being my guest today, and have a great day.
Yeah, take care.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I want to make it really easy for you to reach me. So just send me a text to 31996 and simply text the word growth, GROWTH. In fact, you can right now just say, "Hey Siri," send a message to 31996. And when Siri asks you what you want to send, just say growth. You can do the same thing with OK Google. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to Grief to Growth. Brian hopes that you find this episode helpful and will come back for future episodes. Brian's best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted Not Buried, is a great resource for anyone who is coping with grief or knows someone who is. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, there are 3 things you can do to help. The first is to share the podcast with someone that you think it will help. The second is to go to iTunes, rate, and review the episode. The third way you can support the podcast is by becoming a patron. Head over to www.patreon.com/grief2growth. That's patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, and sign up to make a small monthly donation. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content and knowledge that you are helping to spread the message of grief to growth. For more about Brian and Grief to Growth, visit www.grief2growth.com.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at grieftogrowth.circle.so. That's grief2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.